Abandoned puppy finds love with a lonely old man. Their bond will melt your heart. How will their bond unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The sun barely peeked through the gray clouds hanging over the small countryside village. The chill in the air whispered of the coming winter, and the narrow dirt roads seemed even quieter than usual. A soft wind brushed through the trees, carrying with it the faint rustle of dry leaves. Along one of these lonely paths, a tiny figure shivered beneath an old oak tree. It was a puppy, no more than a few weeks old, its fur a patchwork of white and brown, matted with dirt. The little creature lay curled in on itself, whimpering softly, its ribs visible through its thin coat. The puppy didn't know how long it had been there. Time blurred when every moment was spent fighting hunger and the cold that seeped into its fragile body. Occasionally, it would lift its head, ears twitching at the faint sound of footsteps or the distant rumble of a cart. Each time, hope flickered in its wide brown eyes, but no one stopped. The puppy's tiny form seemed insignificant against the vastness of the empty road. In a small cottage just down the lane, Walter stirred from his sleep. The morning light filtered through the worn curtains, casting patterns on the creaky wooden floor. Walter sat up slowly, his joints stiff from the years that had crept up on him. His hands, calloused from decades of woodworking, rubbed his face as he sighed. Another morning, another day the same as the one before it. He shuffled to the kitchen, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. The house was silent except for the occasional groan of the wind against the old windows. Walter poured himself a cup of coffee, the steam rising lazily as he stared out the window. The garden, once vibrant and full of flowers his wife had tended with care, was overgrown now, a tangle of weeds and bare patches of earth. His eyes lingered on the garden gate, which hung slightly askew. It had been 2 years since Margaret passed. 2 long, quiet years. Walter had once been a man of routine and purpose. He'd built furniture for nearly every household in the village and taken pride in his work. But when Margaret fell ill, everything changed. He cared for her as best as he could, but the sickness took her piece by piece until all that was left was a hollow silence that filled every corner of their home. Walter sipped his coffee, the bitter taste grounding him for a moment. He didn't have much left to do these days. The tools in his workshop had grown dusty, untouched since the day Margaret's laughter had faded from the house. After finishing his coffee, he pulled on his old woolen coat and stepped outside. The cold bit at his cheeks, and his breath hung in the air like faint wisps of smoke. The village was still, the only sound the crunch of gravel under his boots as he made his way toward the lane. He didn't have a destination in mind. He rarely did anymore. Walking had become his only solace, a way to pass the hours that stretched endlessly ahead. As he reached the old oak tree, something made him pause. A faint sound, a whimper, barely audible, drifted through the still air. He frowned, scanning the area until his eyes fell on the tiny figure huddled beneath the tree. At first, he thought it was a bundle of rags someone had carelessly discarded. But then it moved. Walter approached cautiously, his brows furrowing as he crouched down. The puppy lifted its head, its large brown eyes meeting his. For a moment, neither moved. The puppy's tail gave a weak wag, a flicker of hope in its desperate little body. Walter's heart clenched. He had never been much of an animal person, but there was something in the puppy's gaze, a silent plea that pulled at something deep within him. "You poor thing," Walter muttered, his voice rough from disuse. He reached out a hand, hesitating slightly before brushing the puppy's fur. It was cold, and the little creature flinched at first before leaning into his touch. Walter sighed, his hand lingering for a moment. He hadn't touched another living being in so long. The logical part of him told him to walk away. He was an old man living alone. He had no business taking in a puppy. But as he looked at the shivering creature, so small and vulnerable, he knew he couldn't leave it behind. He removed his scarf and carefully wrapped it around the puppy, cradling it in his hands. "Let's get you warmed up," he said softly, more to himself than to the animal. The The puppy gave a soft whine, as if in agreement. Walter turned and began the walk back to his cottage, his pace slower now with the added weight in his hands. The puppy was light, too light, its body fragile and trembling against him. Walter didn't think about what he would do next. He focused only on putting one foot in front of the other, the sound of his boots against the gravel a steady rhythm. Back at the cottage, Walter set the puppy down on a worn blanket by the fireplace. He crouched down, gently unwrapping the scarf and rubbing the puppy's fur to warm it. The little creature didn't protest, its eyes half closed in exhaustion. Walter moved to the kitchen, rummaging through his cupboards. He found a bowl and filled it with warm water, setting it down beside the puppy. The puppy sniffed at it hesitantly before lapping it up, its tiny tail wagging faintly. Walter couldn't help the small smile that tugged at his lips. It was the first time he had smiled in what felt like years. As the puppy drank, Walter sat back on the floor, watching it. "What am I going to do with you?" he murmured. The puppy paused, looking up at him with an almost human expression of gratitude. Walter shook his head, chuckling softly. "Well, I suppose I can't send you back out there." The hours passed, and Walter found himself fussing over the puppy more than he expected. He scrounged up an old bowl for food, cutting up scraps of bread and cheese when he realized he had nothing better to offer. The puppy ate eagerly, its energy returning little by little. That night, as Walter sat in his armchair with the puppy curled up on a makeshift bed beside him, he felt a strange warmth in his chest. It was a feeling he hadn't known in years, a sense of purpose, however small. The puppy stirred in its sleep, letting out a soft sigh. Walter smiled, the sound breaking through the heavy silence that had hung over his home for so long. Walter woke early the next morning, the soft rays of dawn filtering through the curtains. For the first time in years, his routine felt different. There was someone waiting for him. He shuffled out of bed, his joints protesting as he made his way to the living room. The puppy was still curled up on the old blanket by the fire, its small chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of sleep. Walter paused, leaning against the doorway, watching it. A faint smile touched his lips. It was strange how something so small and fragile could bring life back into the house. He moved quietly to the kitchen, filling the kettle and lighting the stove. As he waited for the water to boil, he rummaged through his cupboards, searching for something the puppy might eat. Bread again, he thought, frowning slightly. He'd have to make a trip to the market, another thing he hadn't done in far too long. When the puppy stirred, letting out a tiny yawn, Walter felt a surprising pang of affection. He placed a small dish of water and the bread on the floor, watching as the puppy stretched and padded over to investigate. Its tail wagged furiously as it ate, crumbs scattering across the floor. Walter chuckled, shaking his head. "You're a messy little thing, aren't you?" he muttered. The puppy looked up, its ears perking at the sound of his voice, and Walter found himself laughing. A deep, genuine laugh that echoed through the quiet house. The rest of the day passed in a way that Walter hadn't experienced in years. He found himself moving with purpose, his steps lighter as he busied himself around the house. He cleared a spot in the corner for the puppy's bed, using an old basket lined with a soft towel. He tidied up the living room, which had become cluttered with the remnants of his loneliness. Forgotten newspapers, an empty mug that had sat on the side table for weeks. By mid-afternoon, the house felt different, as though a little piece of Margaret's warmth had returned. The puppy followed Walter everywhere, its tiny paws clicking against the wooden floors. It was as though the little creature had decided he was its world now, and the realization both humbled and warmed him. "Guess I'd better give you a name," Walter said, glancing down at the puppy as they sat by the fire that evening. The puppy tilted its head, as if understanding. Walter thought for a moment, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood on the armrest of his chair. "Charlie," he said finally. "How about Charlie?" The puppy's tail wagged enthusiastically, and Walter chuckled. "Charlie it is, then." That night, Walter sat in his armchair long after the fire had burned down to embers. Charlie was curled up in his basket, his tiny body twitching occasionally as he dreamed. Walter stared at the photograph on the mantel, a picture of him and Margaret, taken years ago on a sunny afternoon in the garden. He felt the familiar ache in his chest, but for the first time it wasn't as sharp. The days turned into weeks, and Charlie became a fixture in Walter's life. The little dog had a boundless energy that seemed to infect everything around him. Walter found himself rising earlier, eager to take Charlie out for their morning walks. The once quiet lane became a place of discovery, with Charlie sniffing every leaf and chasing after imaginary prey. At the market, Walter became a familiar face again. The grocer raised an eyebrow the first time Walter asked for dog food, but he said nothing, simply handing over the bag with a small smile. Walter hadn't realized how much he'd missed the casual conversations, the warmth of the villagers who greeted him as he passed. Charlie, of course, was the star. Children ran up to pet him, laughing as he wagged his tail so hard his entire body seemed to shake. Even old Mr. Cartwright, who rarely spoke to anyone, crouched down to give Charlie a scratch behind the ears one afternoon. Walter watched it all with a quiet pride, marveling at how this little dog had brought so much life back into his world. But it wasn't just the village that changed. Walter found himself drawn back to his workshop, the scent of sawdust and varnish stirring memories of days spent crafting tables and chairs with Margaret humming softly in the background. Charlie would sit by the door, watching intently as Walter dusted off his tools and set to work on small projects. One day, as he sanded the edge of a small wooden box, Walter glanced over at Charlie, who was chewing on an old piece of scrap wood. An idea sparked in his mind. "I'll make you something proper," he said, smiling. Charlie looked up, his tail wagging as if in agreement. Over the next week, Walter poured himself into the project. He carved and sanded, shaping the wood with the care and precision that had once been second nature. Charlie watched him intently, occasionally wandering over to sniff at the pieces. By the end of the week, Walter held up the finished product, a small, intricately carved bed, just the right size for Charlie. When he placed it by the fire that evening, Charlie immediately jumped in, turning in circles before settling down with a contented sigh. Walter sat back, a sense of satisfaction washing over him. It wasn't much, but it felt like a step forward, a way of honoring the skills Margaret had always admired in him. One afternoon, Walter and Charlie set off on a walk down the lane, the autumn air crisp and cool. The leaves crunched underfoot as they meandered along the path, Charlie darting ahead to sniff at every bush and tree. Walter couldn't help but smile as he watched the little dog's boundless enthusiasm. It was during these walks that Walter found himself thinking more and more about Margaret. Not in the sharp, painful way he once did, but with a quiet fondness. He would recall the way she used to hum as she baked, or how her laughter would light up the room during one of their many card games. "Margaret would have loved you, Charlie," Walter said aloud one day, his voice carrying softly on the breeze. Charlie paused, glancing back at him as though he understood. Walter chuckled. "She always wanted a dog, you know? I wasn't keen on the idea back then. Funny how things work out." They reached the edge of the woods, where the path narrowed and the trees formed a canopy overhead. Walter hesitated for a moment. He hadn't ventured this far in years, not since Margaret had fallen ill. But Charlie trotted ahead, tail wagging, and Walter found himself following. The woods were alive with sound, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the soft crunch of Charlie's paws on the earth. It was peaceful, almost meditative, and Walter felt a sense of calm wash over him. As they walked, Walter noticed something he hadn't in a long time: the beauty of the world around him. The way the sunlight filtered through the branches, casting golden patches on the forest floor. The vibrant reds and oranges of the leaves that clung stubbornly to the trees. It was as if Charlie had opened his eyes to the small, everyday miracles he had stopped noticing. Back at the cottage, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Charlie had become Walter's shadow, following him from room to room and curling up at his feet whenever he sat down. The once silent house was now filled with the soft patter of paws, the occasional bark, and the quiet murmur of Walter's voice as he spoke to his companion. Walter's workshop, too, was alive again. He took on small projects for the villagers, a table for Mrs. Abney, a set of shelves for young Mr. Cartwright. Each piece he crafted felt like a step toward reclaiming a part of himself he had thought lost. Charlie, ever curious, would sit by the door, watching intently as Walter worked. One day, as Walter sanded the edge of a wooden frame, a knock at the door startled him. He wiped his hands on a rag and opened the door to find a young woman standing there, holding a small bundle in her arms. "Mr. Miller?" she asked hesitantly. "That's me," Walter replied, glancing down at the bundle. A scruffy little terrier, its leg wrapped in a makeshift bandage. "I heard you're good with animals," the woman said, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I found him on the road, but I don't know what to do. I thought maybe—" Walter glanced back at Charlie, who had trotted over to see what was happening. The little terrier let out a soft whimper, and Walter felt his heart tug in that now familiar way. "Bring him in," he said, stepping aside. Over the next few days, Walter cared for the injured terrier, with Charlie often watching curiously. The young woman, whose name was Emma, stopped by frequently to check on the dog, bringing treats and chatting with Walter as he worked. "He's doing well," Walter said one afternoon as Emma sat at the table. Charlie curled up at her feet. "Should be back on his paws in no time." Emma smiled. "Thank you for taking him in. Not many people would have bothered." Walter shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Charlie's taught me a thing or two about second chances." As the terrier recovered, Walter noticed a change in himself. The weight he had carried for so long seemed lighter, the days brighter. The cottage, once a place of solitude and sorrow, now felt like a home again, filled with life and laughter. One evening, as Walter sat by the fire with Charlie in his lap, he found himself thinking back to that first day, the tiny, shivering puppy he had found beneath the oak tree. He couldn't quite believe how much had changed since then. "You saved me, you know," he said softly, scratching behind Charlie's ears. The little dog looked up at him, his eyes warm and trusting. Walter smiled. "I thought I was helping you, but it turns out I needed you more than you needed me." It wasn't just the companionship Charlie provided. It was the way he had brought Walter back to life, one small moment at a time. The walks, the woodworking, the laughter. All of it had been sparked by this tiny creature with a wagging tail and a boundless heart. As the weeks turned into months, Walter found himself growing more and more attached to Charlie. It wasn't just that the little dog had filled the empty spaces in his home. It was that Charlie had brought color back into Walter's life, a vibrancy he hadn't felt in years. Every morning began with Charlie nudging him awake, his cold nose pressing against Walter's hand until he stirred. The mornings, once filled with silence and solitude, were now marked by the happy sounds of paws patting across the floor and the soft clinking of a dog bowl as Walter prepared breakfast. The little routines they shared became Walter's favorite parts of the day. Their walks grew longer, often venturing deeper into the woods or along the country lanes that stretched beyond the village. Charlie had a knack for finding hidden treasures, an old stick, a patch of wildflowers, even a forgotten shoe that made Walter laugh out loud. One crisp morning, Walter decided to take Charlie to a small lake he hadn't visited in years. It was a spot Margaret had loved, tucked away behind a grove of trees, the water so still it mirrored the sky. As they approached, Walter felt a pang of nostalgia, his chest tightening as memories of Margaret flooded back. Charlie bounded ahead, his tail wagging furiously as he explored the shoreline. Walter sat on an old bench, its wood weathered and splintered but still sturdy. He watched as Charlie darted back and forth, barking at his reflection in the water and chasing the leaves that drifted on the surface. "You'd have loved him," Walter murmured, his gaze fixed on the lake. He imagined Margaret sitting beside him, her laughter ringing out as Charlie splashed into the water. The thought brought a bittersweet smile to his lips. Charlie trotted back to him, a muddy stick clamped in his mouth. He dropped it at Walter's feet, his eyes bright with expectation. Walter chuckled, picking up the stick and tossing it into the shallows. Charlie barked excitedly, bounding after it with a joy that was infectious. For the first time in years, Walter felt at peace. The ache of loss was still there, but it was no longer the all-consuming weight it once was. Instead, it was a quiet presence, softened by the happiness Charlie had brought into his life. That evening, as they returned home, Walter noticed something he hadn't before. Charlie had grown. The once small puppy was now a sturdy young dog, his coat sleek and his movements confident. Walter felt a pang of pride, but also a twinge of sadness. Time was moving forward, as it always did, and Charlie was no longer the fragile little creature he had rescued. As they settled in for the night, Walter found himself looking through an old photo album. The pictures told the story of his life. Margaret smiling as she planted flowers in the garden, Walter standing proudly beside a newly built table, the two of them laughing at some long-forgotten joke. Charlie jumped onto the couch beside him, resting his head on Walter's lap. Walter scratched behind his ears, his gaze lingering on a photo of Margaret holding a tiny kitten. "You know," he said, his voice soft, "I never thought I'd feel this way again. After she was gone, I thought that was it. But then you came along." Charlie wagged his tail, his eyes full of understanding. Walter chuckled, closing the album and setting it aside. "I don't know how I got so lucky, but I'm glad I did." The seasons changed, and with them came new adventures. Winter arrived in a flurry of snow, blanketing the village in white. Charlie loved the snow, bounding through the drifts with a playful energy that made Walter laugh until his sides ached. Walter found himself making small changes around the house, fixing the drafty windows, stacking firewood, even baking for the first time in years. He tried his hand at Margaret's old recipes, with mixed results. Charlie didn't seem to mind, eagerly gobbling up the burnt edges of cookies and the lopsided loaves of bread. The villagers began to notice the change in Walter. He smiled more, stopped to chat at the market, even joined the weekly card game at the pub. It was as though a light had been switched on inside him, one that had been dimmed for far too long. Charlie, of course, was a big part of that. The little dog had a way of drawing people in, his wagging tail and friendly bark a constant source of joy. Children loved him, often running up to pet him as Walter walked through the village. Even the grumpiest of neighbors couldn't resist Charlie's charm. One particularly cold evening, as Walter and Charlie sat by the fire, a knock at the door startled them both. Walter opened it to find Emma standing there, bundled up against the wind. She held a basket in her hands, a small smile on her face. "I thought you might like some company," she said, stepping inside. They spent the evening talking by the fire, Emma sharing stories of her childhood and Walter recounting tales of his woodworking days. Charlie sat between them, his tail wagging happily as he soaked in the warmth of their laughter. As the evening wore on, Walter realized something he hadn't in years. He wasn't alone anymore. Between Charlie, Emma, and the village, his world had grown larger, filled with people and moments that reminded him of the beauty in life. Winter stretched on, the days short and the nights cold, but inside Walter's little cottage, warmth abounded. The fire crackled in the hearth, and Charlie had claimed his favorite spot on the rug, sprawled out with his nose tucked under his paws. Walter sat in his armchair, a blanket draped over his legs, working on a new project, a small wooden plaque for the village church. The visits from Emma had become more frequent. Sometimes she would bring baked goods or soup, claiming it was too much for her to eat alone. Other times, she brought books to lend Walter or simply stayed to talk. They often sat by the fire, laughing and reminiscing about their lives. Walter found himself looking forward to her visits in a way he hadn't expected. Charlie had taken to Emma as well, greeting her at the door with enthusiastic barks and wagging his tail so hard his whole body wiggled. It was as if he could sense that Emma brought a lightness to the house, just as he had. One evening, as Emma and Walter sat sipping tea, she glanced at the photograph of Margaret on the mantel. "She looks lovely," Emma said softly. Walter smiled, his gaze lingering on the photo. "She was the best person I've ever known." Emma hesitated, then said, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but was it hard, losing her?" Walter took a deep breath, the familiar ache stirring in his chest. "It was the hardest thing I've ever been through," he admitted. "She was my whole world. After she was gone, I didn't know who I was anymore. Felt like a part of me had been taken away." Emma nodded, her expression thoughtful. "But you found your way back," she said. "I can see it in the way you talk about Charlie, the way you've started doing your woodworking again. She'd be proud of you." Walter felt a lump in his throat and cleared it with a soft chuckle. "I think Charlie deserves most of the credit. That little rascal dragged me out of the dark, whether I wanted to go or not." Charlie, hearing his name, lifted his head and thumped his tail against the rug. Emma laughed, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "He's a good boy," she said, her voice warm. Walter nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "He really is." As the snow began to melt and the first signs of spring appeared, Walter and Charlie resumed their longer walks. One day, as they strolled along the edge of the woods, Walter noticed a cluster of wildflowers blooming near the path. Their bright yellow petals stood out against the dull brown of the forest floor, a cheerful reminder that winter was finally giving way to warmth and growth. Walter bent down to examine the flowers, a memory stirring in his mind. Margaret had loved wildflowers, often stopping to pick them on their walks. She would arrange them in small vases around the house, filling every room with their simple beauty. "Margaret would have liked these," Walter said aloud, glancing down at Charlie. The dog wagged his tail, his nose twitching as he sniffed the flowers. Walter smiled, plucking a few and tucking them into his coat pocket. When they returned home, Walter placed the flowers in a small jar on the kitchen table. Their bright presence seemed to transform the room, and Walter found himself smiling every time he glanced at them. It was a small thing, but it felt like a tribute to Margaret, a way of keeping her memory alive in the home they had shared. Spring brought new life to the village, and with it, new opportunities. One morning, as Walter sipped his coffee, a letter arrived in the post. It was from the church, thanking him for the wooden plaque he had made and asking if he would be interested in crafting a new altar for the sanctuary. Walter stared at the letter for a long moment, a mixture of surprise and pride washing over him. It had been years since he had taken on a project of that size, but the thought of creating something that would be used and appreciated by so many filled him with a sense of purpose. He glanced at Charlie, who was lying by the door, chewing on an old bone. "What do you think, boy? Should we give it a go?" Charlie barked in response, as if to say, "Why not?" Over the next few weeks, Walter threw himself into the project. He spent hours in his workshop, measuring, cutting, and sanding the wood with meticulous care. Emma stopped by often, bringing sandwiches and tea, and sometimes stayed to help with the lighter tasks. Charlie, as always, was a constant presence, lying at Walter's feet or trotting around the workshop, wagging his tail. As the altar began to take shape, Walter felt a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just about the work. It was about contributing to something larger than himself, about leaving a piece of himself behind for others to appreciate. One evening, as the altar neared completion, Walter sat by the fire with Emma and Charlie. The three of them had fallen into an easy rhythm, their conversations flowing naturally, their silences comfortable. "I've been thinking," Walter said, breaking the quiet, "about how much has changed since I found Charlie." Emma looked at him, her eyes warm and encouraging. "What have you been thinking?" Walter paused, gathering his thoughts. I think I was ready to give up. After Margaret, I didn't see the point in anything. But Charlie, he reminded me that there's still so much to live for. He brought me back to life." Emma smiled, reaching over to place a hand on his. "And you've brought so much to his life, too. It's clear how much he loves you." Walter glanced at Charlie, who was sprawled out on the rug, snoring softly. "I guess we saved each other," he said with a chuckle. Emma nodded. "That's what love does. It saves us, in ways we don't always expect." Walter sat back, his gaze drifting to the photograph of Margaret on the mantel. He felt a deep sense of peace, as though the pieces of his life were finally falling into place. Summer arrived with all its warmth and brightness, and the village seemed to bloom along with the wildflowers that lined the lanes. Walter's garden, long neglected, began to show signs of life as well. It had started with a small patch near the fence, a corner where Charlie had taken to digging. Instead of scolding him, Walter had decided to plant a few flowers there, a small nod to Margaret's love of gardening. As the days grew longer, Walter found himself spending more time outside, tending to the plants and expanding the garden. Charlie was his constant companion, often lying in the shade of the old oak tree or trotting behind Walter as he moved between the rows of flowers. The once wild and overgrown space slowly transformed into a haven, a place filled with color and life. The garden became a focal point for the neighborhood as well. Children would stop by to admire the flowers, their laughter echoing through the air. Neighbors paused to chat over the fence, offering tips on which plants thrived in the summer heat. Walter, who had once felt so isolated, now found himself at the center of a small but vibrant community. Emma, too, became a regular presence in the garden. She often brought over seedlings or cuttings from her own yard, her enthusiasm infectious as she explained the best ways to care for each plant. Walter couldn't help but smile as he watched her and Charlie interact. Emma kneeling in the dirt to plant something new, and Charlie eagerly sniffing at her hands, his tail wagging. One afternoon, as they worked side by side, Emma glanced up at Walter and said, "You know, this garden, it's beautiful. It's like a piece of Margaret is still here." Walter paused, leaning on his spade as he looked around. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, their colors vibrant against the green of the grass. He nodded slowly, his chest tightening with a mix of emotions. "I think she'd like it," he said softly. She always wanted the garden to feel alive, like it was part of something bigger. Emma smiled, reaching out to pat his arm. "You've done her proud, Walter. You really have." The summer brought another milestone, the completion of the altar. Walter had poured his heart into the project, every detail crafted with care and precision. When the day came to deliver it to the church, he felt a mixture of pride and nervousness. Emma and Charlie accompanied him, the three of them riding together in Emma's old truck as the altar sat carefully in the back. The church was buzzing with activity when they arrived, the congregation eager to see Walter's work. As the altar was carried inside and placed in its rightful spot, a hush fell over the room. "It's beautiful," Father Thomas said, his voice filled with awe as he ran his hand over the smooth wood. "You've truly outdone yourself, Walter." Walter nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He glanced at Emma, who gave him an encouraging smile, and then down at Charlie, who sat at his feet, his tail wagging gently. As the congregation gathered around to admire the altar, Walter felt something he hadn't in a long time, a sense of belonging, of being part of something meaningful. It wasn't just about the altar or the garden or even Charlie. It was about the connections he had rebuilt, the life he had rediscovered. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Walter sat on the porch with Charlie by his side. The garden was bathed in a golden light, the flowers glowing softly in the fading daylight. Walter sipped his tea, the warmth of the cup grounding him as he gazed out at the scene before him. His thoughts drifted back to Margaret, as they often did in moments like this. He could almost hear her voice, see her smile, feel her hand in his. But instead of the sharp ache of grief, there was a quiet sense of gratitude. He had loved her deeply, and she had loved him just as fiercely. And though she was gone, her presence was still here, in the garden, in the memories, in the life he had built with Charlie. "You'd be proud of us," Walter said aloud, his voice soft. Charlie lifted his head, his ears twitching as though he were listening. Walter chuckled, reaching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "You'd love Charlie, I know you would. He's a troublemaker, just like you always said we needed." Charlie barked softly, his tail thumping against the porch. Walter smiled, leaning back in his chair as the sky turned shades of pink and orange. The weight he had carried for so long was still there, but it was lighter now, softened by the love and joy that had found its way back into his life. As the seasons turned once more, the changes in Walter's life became even more apparent. The villagers began to rely on him again, not just for his woodworking but for his presence. He became a fixture at community events, often accompanied by Charlie, who had earned a reputation as the village's unofficial mascot. Emma, too, had become a constant in Walter's life. The two of them spent countless hours in the garden, at the market, or simply sitting by the fire sharing stories. Their friendship had grown into something deep and unspoken, a bond forged by mutual respect and understanding. One evening, as they sat in the garden watching the fireflies dance among the flowers, Emma turned to Walter and said, "Do you ever think about what's next? For you, for Charlie?" Walter considered her question, his gaze drifting to the little dog curled up at his feet. "I used to think there wasn't anything left for me," he admitted. "But now I see there's so much more. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I'm not afraid of it anymore." Emma smiled, her eyes warm. "That's a good place to be," she said softly. Walter nodded, the words settling over him like a gentle weight. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face whatever came next, with Charlie by his side and the memories of Margaret guiding him forward. The quiet of the village summer evenings became something Walter cherished deeply. Each day brought a renewed sense of calm and purpose, with Charlie at the heart of everything. The little dog had not only brought life back into Walter's home, but had also changed the way Walter saw the world around him. Everything felt sharper, more vibrant, as though Charlie's presence had reminded Walter to look for the small joys in life. One particular morning, Walter awoke to find Charlie sitting by the door, his ears perked and his tail wagging gently. It wasn't unusual for the dog to be eager for their morning walk, but there was something in Charlie's posture, something almost insistent, that caught Walter's attention. "What's the matter, boy?" Walter asked, his voice thick with sleep as he shuffled toward the door. Charlie barked softly, his gaze fixed on the path leading to the woods. Walter hesitated, a faint unease curling in his stomach. But Charlie's excitement was contagious, and soon Walter found himself pulling on his boots and stepping outside. The air was fresh and cool, the early morning light filtering through the trees as they made their way down the familiar path. Charlie trotted ahead, his nose to the ground, pausing every few steps to look back and make sure Walter was following. They reached the edge of the woods, and Charlie stopped suddenly, his ears twitching as he stared intently into the trees. Walter frowned, his gaze following the dogs. For a moment, everything was still, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then, faintly, Walter heard it, a soft, high-pitched whimper, barely audible above the sounds of the forest. Walter's heart clenched as he stepped closer, his eyes scanning the undergrowth. "What is it, Charlie?" he murmured. Charlie barked again, his tail wagging furiously as he darted toward a cluster of bushes. Walter followed, pushing aside the branches to reveal a small bundle nestled in the grass. At first, he thought it was a pile of rags, but then it moved. A tiny, shivering kitten, its fur matted and its eyes wide with fear. Walter knelt down, his hands trembling slightly as he reached out to the little creature. "Another one, huh?" he said softly, glancing at Charlie. The dog wagged his tail, his eyes bright with approval. Walter chuckled, scooping the kitten into his hands. It was so small, so fragile, its tiny body trembling against his palms. Walter wrapped the kitten in his scarf, cradling it close as they made their way back to the cottage. Once inside, he set the kitten down on the same blanket where he had first placed Charlie all those months ago. The little creature blinked up at him, its wide eyes full of trust. Charlie, ever curious, sniffed at the kitten, his tail wagging gently. The kitten let out a tiny mew, and Charlie stepped back, tilting his head as though trying to figure out what this new addition to their home was. Walter laughed, the sound filling the room with a warmth that felt almost tangible. "Looks like we've got another mouth to feed," he said, rubbing Charlie's head. "Think you can share the spotlight for a while?" Charlie barked, his tail wagging in agreement. The arrival of the kitten brought a new kind of energy to the cottage. Walter named her Rosie, after Margaret's favorite flower, and quickly found himself just as enamored with her as he was with Charlie. The two animals became fast friends, often playing together in the garden or curling up side by the fire. Rosie's playful antics brought a new level of joy to Walter's days. She would pounce on Charlie's tail, chase after stray leaves, and climb onto Walter's lap whenever he sat down to read. Even Charlie, who had been the undisputed center of Walter's world, seemed to welcome the change, his gentle nature shining through as he let Rosie take over his bed or steal his toys. For Walter, the days felt fuller than ever. Between caring for Rosie and Charlie, tending to the garden, and working on new woodworking projects, he hardly had time to dwell on the loneliness that had once consumed him. His home, once so quiet and empty, now felt alive with the sounds of laughter, barks, and the soft patting of paws on the floor. One afternoon, as Walter sat in the garden with Emma, Charlie, and Rosie, he found himself reflecting on how much had changed. The garden was in full bloom, the flowers Margaret had loved standing tall and vibrant under the summer sun. Emma sat beside him, a basket of freshly picked vegetables at her feet, while Charlie and Rosie chased each other around the yard. "I never thought I'd have this again," Walter said, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. Emma turned to him, her eyes warm. "Have what?" "A home," Walter said simply. "Not just a house, but a real home. One filled with life and love and purpose." Emma smiled, reaching out to place a hand on his arm. "You've built this, Walter. Piece by piece, you've brought it all back." Walter nodded, his gaze drifting to Charlie and Rosie. "I couldn't have done it without them," he said. "They've taught me so much. About love, about resilience, about second chances." Emma's smile widened. "And you've taught them too. You've given them a safe place, a family. That's no small thing." Walter felt a lump rise in his throat, and he cleared it with a soft chuckle. "Well, I guess we've all saved each other in one way or another." As the sun began to set, casting the garden in a warm golden light, Walter felt a deep sense of contentment settle over him. Life wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was full, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. He looked over at Emma, who was laughing at Charlie's antics, and at Rosie, who had climbed into his lap and was purring softly. He thought of Margaret, of the life they had built together, and of how she would have loved this moment. "Thank you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to Emma, to Charlie and Rosie, or to Margaret herself. Maybe it was all of them. And as the first stars appeared in the sky, Walter knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. As autumn crept into the village, the leaves turned brilliant shades of orange and gold, painting the landscape with a fiery beauty. Walter found himself drawn to the woods more frequently, walking with Charlie and Rosie by his side. The air was crisp, and the faint scent of wood smoke lingered as villagers prepared their homes for the colder months. The cottage had become a sanctuary, not just for Walter but for Charlie and Rosie, and even for the occasional visitor. Emma often dropped by with baked goods or supplies, staying for tea or to help Walter with his woodworking projects. Her presence had become as much a part of Walter's life as the animals that had transformed his world. One chilly morning, as Walter was putting the finishing touches on a small rocking chair he'd crafted for one of the village children, a knock came at the door. He wiped his hands on a rag and opened it to find Father Thomas standing on the porch, his face flushed from the cold. "Good morning, Walter," the priest said, offering a small smile. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Walter replied, stepping aside to let him in. "Come in and warm yourself by the fire." Father Thomas entered, glancing around the cozy cottage. Charlie and Rosie greeted him with wagging tails, and the priest chuckled as he bent down to scratch their ears. "I've heard quite a lot about you lately," Father Thomas said as he straightened up. "The villagers can't stop talking about how you've brought the church's altar to life. And I must say, the garden you've grown is nothing short of a miracle." Walter waved a hand dismissively, though a faint blush crept up his cheeks. "I've just been keeping busy, that's all." Father Thomas shook his head. "It's more than that, Walter. You've given this village a gift, not just through your work, but through your kindness and resilience. I wanted to thank you for that." Walter felt a lump rise in his throat, and he nodded, unable to find the words to respond. Father Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder, his gaze warm. "Sometimes, it takes the smallest things to remind us of the greatest truths. Your story with Charlie and Rosie, It's a testament to the power of love and second chances. As the days grew colder, Walter found himself reflecting more and more on the journey that had brought him to this point. It wasn't just about Charlie or Rosie or even Emma, though they were at the heart of it. It was about how life had a way of surprising you, of bringing you back to yourself when you thought all was lost. One evening, as the first snow of the season began to fall, Walter sat by the fire with Emma. Charlie lay at his feet, his head resting on Walter's slipper, while Rosie curled up in Emma's lap, purring softly. "I've been thinking," Walter said, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. Emma looked up, her brow arching in curiosity. "About what?" "About Margaret," Walter said, his gaze fixed on the fire. "She always said we should open our home to others, that we had enough love to share. I think she'd be proud of what we've done here." Emma smiled, reaching over to place a hand on his. "I know she would." Walter turned to her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "And I want to thank you, too, for being here, for helping me see that there's still so much left to live for." Emma's smile softened. "You didn't need me for that, Walter. You've always had it in you. Charlie and Rosie, they just reminded you of what you were capable of." Walter chuckled, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the fire. "Well, they've certainly kept me on my toes." The winter passed slowly, each day a blend of quiet moments and small joys. Walter found himself busier than ever, taking on new projects for the villagers and hosting more visitors than he ever thought possible. The cottage, once so silent and still, was now filled with laughter and life. On one particularly bright morning, Walter stood in the garden, watching as the snow melted in the sunlight, revealing the green shoots of the flowers he had planted the year before. Charlie and Rosie played nearby, their energy a stark contrast to the calm serenity of the scene. Emma appeared at his side, her cheeks pink from the cold. "They're beautiful," she said, gesturing to the emerging flowers. Walter nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "It feels like a fresh start every time they bloom." Emma glanced at him, her eyes warm. "That's what you've built here, Walter. A fresh start. For you, for Charlie and Rosie, and for all of us who are lucky enough to be part of it." Walter's chest swelled with emotion, and he reached down to scratch Charlie's ears as the dog bounded over to him. "I think you're right," he said softly, "and I wouldn't change a thing." As the seasons turned once more, the village seemed to carry Walter's story with it. The old man who had once been so withdrawn and sorrowful had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that love and second chances could transform even the darkest of days. And through it all, Charlie and Rosie remained by his side, their unwavering loyalty and boundless joy a constant source of inspiration. Walter knew that life would continue to bring its challenges, its moments of pain and uncertainty, but he also knew that he had everything he needed to face it: love, companionship, and a heart that had been mended piece by piece. One evening, as the sun set over the garden, casting it in hues of gold and orange, Walter sat on the porch with Emma, Charlie, and Rosie. The air was warm, the scent of flowers drifting on the breeze. Walter closed his eyes, letting the peace of the moment wash over him. "Thank you," he whispered, his words carried by the wind. Whether he was speaking to Margaret, to Charlie and Rosie, or to the universe itself, he wasn't entirely sure. But in his heart, he knew the sentiment was true. He was exactly where he was meant to be.